Are you worried I'm going to screw it up again?
Hey, we've been doing this a long time, and if it only happened once, I'll take that as a win. So I have done some webinars where I forgot to hit record at all, which was unfortunate. So not this one. Okay, welcome everybody. I see that it is 12 Central. Welcome to the Tree Fund webinar series. We will go ahead and kick it off today. My name is Bo Broadbeck. I'm an extension specialist in community forestry and arboriculture here at Auburn University. It is our pleasure to work with Tree Fund and host and moderate today's Tree Fund webinar. We have three fantastic speakers with us today on, I think, a very applied topic that, as we all know with arboriculture, we continue to learn new things. And so I'm very interested to see what information they will be presenting for us today. To give us a little update on Tree Fund, we have with us today a fellow trustee on the Board of Trustees at Tree Fund, Rachel Barker. And as always, we also have Monica Otting, who provides all of the hard work behind the scenes that make this Tree Fund webinar function. A lot of y'all send me emails with how things are working, but I will tell you, I am just the host and moderator. Monica does a lot of the hard work there. So thank you, Monica. And Rachel, I will turn it over to you to give us a little bit of an update on Tree Fund and introduce today's speakers.
All right, thank you. Rachel Barker, as Bo said, I'm a Tree Fund trustee. I'm the director of the Project Management Office for Arborimetric Solutions, and welcome. I saw just all the list of names. We have people from Switzerland, Brazil, Singapore, all over Canada, everywhere. It's really great. So I'm really excited. The Tree Fund mission is to explore and share the science of trees, contributing to the lives of people, communities, economies, and the environment, and of the planting, and sustainability of urban and community trees. The Tree Fund advances this mission by issuing research grants, primarily applied research in how to better plant, propagate, and care for urban trees, not forests. Providing scholarships to students in arboriculture, urban forestry, horticulture, and related topics, and funding education for kids K through 12 related to trees and environmental stewardship. Since 2002, the Tree Fund has awarded over $4.5 million for our research and education grants. Tree Fund's current research priorities include root and soil management, tree planting and establishment, plant health care, risk assessment and worker safety, and urban and community forestry management. So please join us next month for our last webinar of the year. So we're currently working on 2022 webinar series, and we'll post the schedule on the Tree Fund website when it's ready. So just a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and available on the Tree Fund website in about 1 week. We are committed to bringing you even more webinars and to give you an opportunity during your CEUs. Please donate at treefund.org or follow the link that Monica is now posting in the chat box. Your support will make a difference. $10, $20, $25, $5, any amount really helps us to continue to bring these types of webinars to you and to get your CEUs. So one last housekeeping note before I introduce our speakers. In accordance with the ISA and SAF guidelines, the Tree Fund will submit your name and certification number to ISA and or the SAF for your CEU credit. And if you've not submitted your certification number during your registration, you'll need to email treefundwebinars@gmail.com with your name and certification number. And you must watch this webinar in its entirety to qualify for CEU credits. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers today for the presentation of digging into the science of tree planting and removing packaging materials. Richard Hauer, PhD, is a professor of urban forestry at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, teaching courses in urban forestry, nursery management, woody plants, dendrology, and introduction to forestry. He received his BS from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, his MS from the University of Illinois, and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Rich has conducted research in tree biology, urban forest management, emerald ash borer management, trees and construction, trees risk management, and ice storms. He recently was honored at the 2018 LC Chadwick Award for arboriculture research. He's published over 160 publications and presented over 400 talks throughout the world. And Dr. Hauer is also an associate editor of the Journal of Urban and Forestry and Urban Green Spaces. Andrew Koeser, PhD, Associate Professor of Environmental Horticulture and Landscape Management at the University of Florida. Andrew is professor at the University of Florida's Gulf Coast Research and Education Center, where he conducts research on issues relating to urban landscape sustainability, tree risk assessment, and storm failure prediction, and factors that influence urban tree growth and longevity. He received his BS from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, MS from University of Illinois, and his PhD also from the University of Illinois. He's also tree risk assessor qualified. Andrew's a prolific researcher and writer, which has earned him the ISA's 2017 R.W. Harris Authors Citation Award and 2015 Early Career Scientist Award. And our third speaker is Jason Missbauer, PhD. He's an arboriculture researcher at the Morton Arboretum. His research focuses on factors that predispose trees to storm damage and cultural practices to reduce susceptibility to storm damage. Jake earned his PhD from the University of Florida and his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, majoring in urban forestry and business administration. Jake's an ISA certified arborist with several years experience in the tree care industry as a practicing arborist. He actively engages in outreach to the tree care industry and is presented on topics that include tree biomechanics, restoration of storm damaged trees, proper tree pruning methods, tree planting and stabilization, and safety in arboriculture. So welcome to our three speakers. With no further ado, we will get started. Do I stop share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation today. I'm here with two of my best friends and closest collaborators, Rich Hauer and Jake Missbauer, or Jason, proper name here, to talk about some like a wide range of the research that we've done over the last couple of years. A core group of this is going to be talking about the packaging materials that come with bald and burlap trees, but we're broadening this to kind of mirror a recent article that we submitted to Arborist News, and we'll show you that in a little bit. So, and the main theme behind this whole talk will be, planting for longevity in urban forestry. Like this tree right here, actually, this is several trees planted very close together naturally that survived development in a campus in Tampa area. We hope to see the trees that we plant now last for generations or longer. So, and this longevity, this time factor for trees comes up quite a bit. There's quotes out there. I'm sure everyone here has heard this one. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Showing that it does take a while to reap from that investment that's made at planting, that investment of time and materials and all the things that went into the nursery beforehand. That investment may not even be realized for you or your loved ones. It could be for future generations you don't even know. Another quote is, "A society grows great when old people plant trees in shade that they will never sit in." This tree was probably not planted. This tree is probably a remnant of pre-development, but as an acorn, and that just to imagine that it would ever reach the size that it is today now. Like how many seedlings, how many saplings didn't make it before this tree took off and really became something that would be preserved for the future. And to that note, I saw this when I was walking through Tampa one day, just on a whim. I saw this amazing tree first, and I saw the plaque second, and it was just great to see. I didn't know that TCIA or ISA did anything like this, but back in 1997, they said that this tree is being recognized as having witnessed the city of Tampa grow from a city of 5,000 to the city of 350,000 or so that it was back in 1997. So, we need to take a time to recognize these trees and protect them. And one of the best ways we can protect trees in urban forests is to give them a healthy start from the start. I remember my first conference when I was an undergrad at Stevens Point. People were really talking about, young tree mortality quite a bit at the conference that I attended. And there was a comment made that, a comment that I've heard several times since then, that what's the point? Trees only live 7 years in the landscape anyways, and this kind of throwaway mentality can be counterproductive if we let it get too close to us and let us, if we take it to heart too much. Is there a 7-year itch, or a 14 or a 15 or a 10 or whatever you've heard? There is truly increased mortality at the time of planting. It's a very stressful time for trees. But is it as dire as that the average life expectancy of a tree is really 7 years? Or is that even a useful metric, Because with any population of plants, there's usually a lot more young than older individuals. Well, we did do a little research on this. Actually, I didn't do this. This was Deb Hilbert, Dr. Deb Hilbert, my former PhD student, really dug into the literature to kind of get a sense of how long trees are living and what's causing them to die and be removed prematurely. And she went through pretty much all of the literature, did a complete search of AUF and urban forestry urban greening, and then did a structured word search through Web of Science and other sources, and found that things aren't really as bleak as we like to think, right? So this is what we call a half-life. So at the point at which you'd expect half of the trees to still be alive and half of them to die. And you can see here, the half-life is that dashed line in the middle. In the worst trials that we found, the bottom 25%, yeah, you're getting to the point where about half the trees are dying at 7 or 11 years, But just as often, you have trees that are making it 30, 33, 38 years, nearly half a century. And that's quite impressive, And if you go middle of the road, the middle 50%, you're looking at 13 to 18 years. So, and the reason it's kind of grayed out is we were using projections based on annual mortality, but things are not as bad as we like to make it think. And this kind of corroborates with some of the other research that we've been doing. When I was still at Illinois, we did a life cycle assessment of urban trees in the Chicago area, seeing how long they live, how much inputs went into them, figuring out when they broke even from a carbon point of view. And in this, we surveyed many of the municipal arborists and urban foresters in the Chicago area. And these ladies and gentlemen said that they expected the trees that they planned to live 50 years in residential landscapes and 30 years in commercial landscapes, kind of in line with what we saw with that lit review. And then here's another project that Rich and I have been working on, and others, where we are tracking trees that have been subjected to construction activities in the Milwaukee area. And Rich and his crew started, inventorying this stuff in 1979. The first revisit of the data was when I was 6 years old, wearing lederhosen just north of Milwaukee. And this is one of those long-term studies that we always say we need and rarely have the funds to do, but it's showing us a lot of great things with regard to construction activities and preservation. And it's also showing us that, more than 50% of the trees are surviving from that 1979 inventory. So with that, we need to think of a long-term mindset when we think of planting, and we need to think in tree time. And when you think in tree time, you're looking to the future. When you're selecting trees based on tree time, you're thinking about the pests and outbreaks that are down the road, right? You're looking at pest forecasts, disease forecasts, looking at things that are cropping up in other continents that could affect the genuses and species in your home country, right? If you're an oak, if you're a maple, something that's quite common in Eurasia, you're going to be worried if you're in North America because things over there can cross over, right? You're also going to think about development patterns in the future. You know, things are getting more compact, and our ability to put big trees in place is diminishing as we infill our urban areas and make developments closer together and maximize the footprint of the house on each little lot that we give them. And also climate's changing. Rich and Jake and I all hail from Wisconsin. That used to be under ice. There used to be glacial lakes there. You know, the ice age was climate change before it became political, right? So climates are changing. And you need to think ahead. What, you know, maybe a hardiness zone could flip, and that could be a good thing for some species, or it could bring more pest pressures as well. So these are to think about in the future. What I'm going to focus a lot on for the rest of my section is site selection. And how do you plan for a large growing or just larger growing, if it's a small stature tree, in the urban areas that we have now, in the urban planting spaces that we have. To do this, you need to think about two different things, and they're very similar and they're related, but they're not the same. There's some key differences, and that's minimum planting width and minimum soil volume. From a minimum soil volume is essentially the reserves that a tree have to make it through dry conditions, right? So imagine like a vaulted soil pit or container such as this right here. That has limited pore space for air and for water. The water is the limiting factor when it gets dry. And so that volume needs to be big enough to sustain the tree in prolonged periods of drought. And then if not, then supplemental water needs to be provided. And Jim Urban, if you haven't read this book, it's great. It builds on some of his research and others' research. It's called Up by Roots, and it shows people how to design these planting spaces, or at least look at what you have already designed and see what tree is appropriate. So this is a chart that shows the tree size and then the soil volume required. And again, that is the soil volume required to give it the water it needs for growing conditions. And if you use this equation, if you figure out the cubic rooting space for a given container, like these right here, say they're 2 meters by 2 meters by 1 meter, 2 meters long, wide, and tall, you're looking at about 4 cubic meters of soil space. And that's, so given these, they look like your aspen or birch, either one likes water. Given these trees, how long do you think that they have in these containers before they need to be switched out or irrigated? Well, if you work backwards from this slide, you can see that 4 cubic meters of soil is about sufficient to support a 7 centimeter DBH tree, or a 2-inch tree. So these trees are pretty much at their capacity right now in the space that they were given. And then for those folks that don't like metric, about 70 cubic feet of soil is required to support 1 inch of DBH. And when I used to talk about this, I didn't really have a good container picture. I want to use my own pictures, and I kind of thought about this as an option, but this is kind of getting at the other thing, which is the minimum planting width. So when you have a cutout like this in a parking lot, this is not a vaulted planting space. Roots can escape underneath the sidewalk and get into the surrounding lawn. They can get actually underneath the asphalt because there's a really thin base layer there that's not going to prevent roots from growing. We know because they're taking up the asphalt right now with the roots. So this is really not a question of minimum soil volume. This is actually how much space does the tree have before it starts butting up against some hardscape, right? And that butting up of the hardscape, that sidewalk collision, the lifting of sidewalks, the cracking of sidewalks, and other hardscape is a very costly problem that cities deal with. In Tampa, I talked to their civil engineers. They spend $500,000 a year on repairs. They would love to spend $2 million budget allowed a year on repairs, and they by and far feel that the majority of their conflicts are caused by trees, lifting or raising the sidewalks. It's a big problem. The one study on this that really tried to quantify the impact was by McPherson in 2000, serving 18 California cities. And by today's standards, it would be $36 million in repairs annually on conflicts between sidewalks and trees. And you just have to sit and watch your neighbor try to wheel down in a wheelchair to class or what have you, and know that that situation down there with that raised sidewalk is not sustainable for everyone, and everyone should have access to the safe transport and mobility. And this is a big problem in Florida as well. We're pushing development's going like crazy. Trees are in most municipal codes as being required at planting, but there's not the space there. And then you end up with situations like this where, an entire neighborhood is removing every single one of its live oak that's planted between the sidewalk and the street in one swoop before things get even more costly for them. After like 8 years in the landscape, way before the trees have had a chance to pay back their environmental debt. So, what's happening is, roots can pour over the sidewalk, roots can lift sidewalks as well. And that zone of rapid taper is something that we need to account for in our planning. And if you don't account for it, if you just replace a sidewalk after it's lifted and you cut into the roots, there can be significant consequences to the health of the tree, and then also to the stability of the tree. Some recent work by Gary Johnson and others in Minnesota found that trees that were given just double the space, going from 8 feet from 4 feet to 8 feet, were half as likely to fall over in wind events based on some of the data they got from some straight line winds. So what Eric North, Gary Johnson, and my lab and others have worked on is creating these relationships between DBH, is a very common measurement for urban foresters, and root flare, to kind of show you how much space is needed to account for that tree in planting pits or in sidewalk terraces or whatever you want to call them. And these are very strong relationships. And it's a bit of an art as well as a science to figure out where the flare ends. We're looking for transitions between the bark and the root bark is often our key for that. And we also threw a bunch of stuff at this, trying to see how other things can impact that relationship between diameter and root flare. And out of all the things we looked at, it's just a very simple, straight DBH to trunk flare. None of these other aspects even impacted the relationship whatsoever. So, this is a pretty stable relationship even across species. So we're able to come up with predictions of trunk flare diameter based on DBH for upland, wetland, and variable, and species that are more plastic. And with these equations, we can actually predict that trunk flare diameter. And diameters are usually in centimeters or inches, so there's a conversion factor, and we add in a buffer for the unseen zone of rapid taper, and you can figure out, based on how big trees grow of a certain species in your area, how much space you need. So for Tampa, if you want a live oak to grow to its maximum potential and still not interfere with anything, you're going to need 15 feet. Not every tree is going to make it to the maximum potential, so that's going to save you. And if the site doesn't allow for that, at least now you know when you can expect issues to arise just by looking at diameters in your inventory, and know that, okay, for this neighborhood, when things start getting to 12, maybe we'll need to inspect our sidewalks a little bit more. We also did this for small trees, and we found that this is a preprint right now, hasn't been published yet, but it is available on preprints.org if anyone's interested. And we did find we found that it had a very similar relationship. And it also, our buffer that we were using for the big trees, we could actually have that. So a tree that is 200, a shade tree that's 200 centimeters away from hardscape has the same likelihood of lifting the sidewalk as one that is a small tree that's 100 centimeters away. So you can essentially have that buffer zone. And lastly, before I move on to Jake, is we got a little crazy with our odds ratios, thought about Vegas a little bit, and we were able to put some dollars to what an odds ratio really means, which is pretty fun, honestly. Sometimes those are a measurement that is hard to explain and maybe isn't as relevant as we'd like it to be, even though the math works. And we found that, just moving from essentially a route right up against the hardscape to say 100 centimeters away will save the city of Tampa $120 on average per tree, given the cost that they have to pay to replace sidewalks and do tree work around the area. And then the Milwaukee, it's much cheaper because that's actually the fee that the homeowner would be paid, and that's also there's a tax that helps offset that. So these are really useful figures, and it just shows the dollars and cents that goes behind giving more space to trees out there. And with that, I will move on to Jake. Jake, just tell me when you want me to switch slides, okay?
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'll just say next. Next. So just segueing now from Andrew's talk about tree longevity, one of the most important things that we can do to help to ensure trees live a long, healthy life and provide the services that we plant them for in the first place is to make sure that we plant trees properly. Next slide. Just to start with, so looking at one of the major causes, and Rich can talk about this maybe a little bit more later, but they recently published a paper looking at the root cause of many of the problems, or majority of the problems that we see in the landscape, and that is stem girdling roots. Stem girdling roots occur when oftentimes trees are planted too deep, and the roots will either kink or deflect. Next slide. As you can see here in this picture, this picture here is from a study that we did on some root systems of ash trees that were planted too deep or at grade, looking at differences in growth and then ultimately in stability. This is a 3D model of one of the root systems of one of the trees in the study. You can see that the arrow pointing to a root that is kinked and circling around the trunk, and if over time, as this root and the trunk continue to grow, that root will grow into the trunk of the tree and girdle it. Also interesting to just point out as an aside, the initial root flare of this tree was down, this tree was planted approximately a foot too deep, and you can see a majority of these large main structural roots lower down in the root system, and then this larger root up here towards the top on the left is actually an adventitious root that the tree put on post planting. The initial root flare was much lower. Next slide. So when trees are planted, they should be planted with the root collar visible. I think this is a review for a lot of us, but I guess the first question is, what is the root collar? And the root collar is the part of the plant where the stem and the root system meet. Sometimes we call it a root flare. And I like the term root stem transition zone. So when you say, where is the root collar, it varies based on this transition zone where it varies in size based on the tree as it ages. Next slide. And you can see here, with a smaller tree on the left, the root collar is very small as the as the flaring from the trunk into the root tissue is small proportionally to, in line with the size of that tree. And as the tree gets larger, as it ages and, gravitational and wind forces act on the tree gets this, typical collar or flaring or swelling at the base. So this root stem transition zone, or this root collar, is kind of this whole area where the stem, as it transitions down into the root system. And we want that absolutely visible when that tree is planted into the ground. Next slide. And these problems, in a lot of cases, not all cases, and I know that we've got some nursery folks on here, so please don't think I'm disparaging all nursery people, but the fact of the matter is that a lot of trees come out of the nursery too deep, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I think this is something that, as practitioners, from the people growing the trees to the people planting the trees to the people caring for the trees, we all need to pay close attention to this, because this is one of the single things that we can do early on in the tree's life when we plant the tree, that we can help to ensure that it gets off on the right foot. So you can see here, whether it's a container grown tree or a ball and burlap tree, you have this, the root flare visible above the soil line. You can see where the gentleman's pointing in the container tree, and then right by his fingers on his left hand in the ball and burlap tree on the right, you can see the flaring of the root system. And don't confuse the root graft or the graft of the stem to the rootstock as where that is. We often see that trees planted so that just the top of that rootstock is visible, people mistaking that for the root flare, which it is not. In looking at this graphic up here on the upper right, you can see as trees are planted, on the left, you've got this incorrect planting with loose soil above the root flare, juxtaposed to correct planting with the top of the soil off of the root ball and the flare clearly visible. Next slide. And this is kind of the consequences of that improper planting. These marks on this trowel are 1 inch increments. So you can see 5, this would be 6 inches. So we're talking about 10 inches or, 8, 10 inches. So 20, 25 centimeters until we got to that first main structural root. So, on top of all of this soil mounding up on top, it's, this is an area where we get really bad problems with girdling roots growing into that media, and we can't see the visible defects that may be present at the time. Yeah, somebody put in the comments, volcano mound. Yeah, so this is both mulching and soil piled up here in this specific instance. A lot of times we just see the mulch, volcano mulched around it, but oftentimes we see soil piled up on that as well at the time of planting. So make sure we avoid this when we plant trees. Next slide. And in the nursery, this comes from work from Dr. Arnold down in Texas, looking at trees planted, young trees, whips or liners planted either at grade or 3 inches too deep, 7.5 centimeters too deep. They were 15 centimeters at planting, and then 1, 2, 3 years subsequently after planting, trees that were planted at grade grew more rapidly than trees that were planted 3 inches too deep. So after 1 year, there's a 15% reduction in growth. After 2 years, 34%. After 3 years, 36%. So for nursery people, you have an economic incentive to grow your trees from liners to be at grade, because they will grow faster and you'll have saleable merchandise more quickly. Next slide. But moving on, there's a question that kind of has been gone back and forth on, and there's still quite a bit of debate. Should we remove the wire basket at planting? Next slide. Some people give you arguments for removal, such as the stress of the wire cage girdling or partially girdling or holding the root system in. Another argument is for removing the root ball. Next slide. Long-term stability of the tree. Here you can see the wire that has been encompassed by the basket, and some cracking that occurred as that had become enveloped. Next slide. Safety. You can see a stump grinder. People sometimes worried that if after the tree has to be removed and the stump ground out, the wire can get caught up in the grinder wheel, possibly being flung in the air and causing a potential for injury for the person grinding the stump, for example. As an aside, just based on my personal experience and observation, something a lot more aggravating would be for the people who cut this tree down to leave the stump that tall when I show up with the stump grinder to have to deal with grinding all that stump down. So yeah, we always appreciated a much more flush cut when we had to go grind the stump. Anyway, sorry, next slide. And another argument is that it's required by specification. Some specifications call for cutting the burlap and the twine and perhaps like the top of the cage off of the top of the root ball at the time of planting. So you can see that there's a lot of different reasons why people say that the wire basket should be fully or at least partially removed. Next slide. And I'd like to just add to that. Here, this is a sample that a local tree care professional brought in to show me. His client had a linden tree in their yard that was really struggling. And he did an excavation and came upon this. This is next slide, non-biodegradable twine that had girdled the original stem. So you can see down below, this is the stem as the size that it was below the twine when it finally girdled and died, and the original root system below. Next slide. And then above it, you have adventitious roots that grew into the soil above the girdling twine. So obviously this tree is also planted too deep if those roots were able to go into soil that was that far above the original planting or root flare in the top of the root ball. So obviously the top of the root ball at the time of planting, we can see right where that is because this is where that non-biodegradable twine was. Anyway, so absolutely, I think most places at this point use biodegradable materials, but if not, you have to get that non-biodegradable twine off of the, from being tied and wrapped around the top of that root ball, or you're going to run into problems down the road. So next slide. So let's take a look at some of the arguments for retaining the root ball. The first one being to prevent undue root ball disruptions. Here you can see root balls sometimes will fall apart, especially with looser soil aggregates and soil properties inside of the root ball from the nursery. Next slide. Stability after planting. There's some anecdotal evidence and people have pointed out that trees that have the root ball or the wire basket removed from the root ball are more likely to uproot right after planting. Next slide. Added labor. It takes more time to remove the wire basket at the time of planting rather than just leaving it on. Next slide. And comply with warranty requirements. Some places will say that warranty is voided if the root ball is not planted, or the root tree is not planted with the planting materials or the root ball materials over the root ball. So we have arguments for and against retaining or removing the materials, the basket around the root ball on ball and burlap trees. Next slide. And here, so years ago, Bonnie Appleton looked into this, looking at different references for whether wire basket should be retained or removed. Next slide. And of all of references that were made from that search, only 2 of them had conclusions that were from actual peer-reviewed research. From Loomis and Struger in 1988, saying that wire engulfed in vascular tissue, the wire was engulfed by the vascular tissue and it had reconnected 11 years, an 11-year-old willow. And then another paper where fully girdled seedlings with floral wire had some reduced growth metrics. And that was about it from what they found for peer-reviewed research. Next slide. So given that, a study looking at wire basket retention or removal was conducted at 2 nurseries, one outside of the Minneapolis area, and then one near Manitowoc, Wisconsin. So trees were either planted with the entire root ball left on, intact, the top portion of the wire cage removed, so the materials removed from the top of the root ball and around the very top of the sides of the root ball, or the cage and burlap fully removed. And the results from this study after 2 or 3 years, yes, with some of the with the partial removal or full removal, there some of the root balls did fall apart. The white thing, what is the white thing for? Just, I believe that was protecting the trunk at the time of planting, but Rich or Andrew could probably confirm that better. I wasn't there at the time of
Yeah,
planting.
actually for deer prevention.
Oh, okay, for buck rubs, okay. All right, next slide. So looking at root ball breakage, when the root balls were left intact. So these were, these 2 locations, and the species planted were honey locust and Norway maple. So the root balls that were left intact, there was no breakage. And at both of the nurseries, there was some root ball breakage noticed for both the both species at both sites. So next slide. Material removal time for trees that were intact. It took 2.5 minutes roughly to remove materials. I presume this would be maybe the twine that was holding the crown together, or some other materials. It took roughly 2.5 to 3 minutes longer at both sites for partial and or full removal of the basket. So 2.5 to 3 minutes per tree. Next slide. Looking at caliper growth. After 2 to 3 years, for honey locust at Minnesota and Wisconsin, Norway maples, Minnesota and Wisconsin, annual caliper growth, there was no difference between any of the 3 treatments, whether the root ball, the basket was left intact, partially or fully removed. Next slide. So, I mean, so the 2 to 3 year timeline takeaway is that it really doesn't matter as far as whether you left it on or removed it for growth. There was more time initially at planting to remove the extra materials, which stands to reason. So looking at 5 to 6 years later, this is the publication that you can find those results in. Next slide. So the trees were left in place, and a few years later, we came back, and this was the time when we finished the study. So we were able to do some destructive analysis looking at tree stability in the landscape. So we did static pull tests to failure, looking at differences in resistance to uprooting between the 2 species and the 3 planting treatments. And what we found at the is that for the Norway maple, there's no difference between removal, and for honey locust, there was no difference between level of wire basket removal. The honey locust trees were much more strongly rooted in place than the maple trees, but between the treatments, it did not matter, and across sites, it didn't matter. Next slide. So looking at caliper growth for Norway maple and honey locust, both sites, there was no difference in caliper growth 5 to 6 years after removal. Next slide. And looking at twig elongation, the honey locust trees had longer twig elongation than the Norway maple did, but there was no difference between sites or treatments. So again, going back several years later, 5-6 years on, there's no difference whether or not you left the root ball on or you removed it. So next slide. Oh yeah, just go ahead, next slide after this. So kind of getting back, I guess kind of the results of that work is, it really doesn't matter, if you feel more comfortable leaving it on, leave it on. If you feel more comfortable removing it, that's fine too, depending upon, based on those parameters that we looked at for growth and stability. Now, I want to go back to the caveat, and this slide is here to remind me of that you need to make sure that the root flare is at the top of the root ball if you're going to retain the basket. So one way to do that, these images are from Gary Watson back in 2005, using some a sharp instrument, a surveyor stake or some other, maybe a screwdriver, typically would work, but go 4 inches, 10 centimeters away from the trunk, and you want to hit structural roots from the top of the root ball no more than 3 inches or 7.5, 7-8 centimeters down. You better be into large flare roots. If not, you're going to need to peel the top of that root ball away to find that root flare or the trunk flare or root stem transition zone, whatever you want to call it, so that you know that you're planting that tree at grade and not planting too deep. So looking for that flare in the root ball, regardless, of, if you can see it right at planting, great. You want to leave the materials on, leave the materials on. But if you cannot see that and you're not finding it in those top couple few inches or half dozen or so centimeters, you want to make sure to pull that away and pull the soil away until you find where that material is. So anyway, next slide. And just real quick, I know that most of this is about ball and burlap, but I also want to talk about container trees. Just a couple quick slides. I did my PhD work with Ed Gilman, and I think I'm somehow contractually obligated to talk about container trees and girdling roots. So looking at, trees that grow in containers, the root systems on them are almost always going to have circling roots. It's almost unavoidable. So, here you can see where the root system, that you can see where the implant of the container was, and this tree had no chance. Next slide. And then, so when you're planting container trees, go ahead and loosen up and get rid of those circling or kinked or deflecting or rising or sinking roots along the outer edge. I saw some folks from the Bartlett Research Lab, so they might recognize this fellow. But we're looking at taking off, using tools to remove those circling roots at the time of planting. Or another way is you can just put the tree, take it out of the container, put it in the hole, backfill it, 1/2 to 2/3, and then take a sharp flat edge shovel and just remove the outer, a couple centimeters, outer inch or so, all the way around the container or the root ball, and that will get rid of almost all of the defects that you experience. So just a couple quick slides on container grown trees. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rich for talking about post-transplanting care.
Hey, thanks, Jake. Next slide. So next slide, Andrew. So if this whole research that we did, there's a lot of questions people have. What about 10 years? I wish there were studies longer. We have the longest studies that went 9 years. We found no difference. Could it be in year 15? Don't know. Certainly that's an area for research. However, from information, as a practitioner and research that we've done, my opinion, whether you remove or not, it's a personal decision, as Jake said. I think what's more important is planting depth, certainly aftercare practices. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so next slide, please. So on support systems, as you just saw, ANSI has standards that you should consider supporting systems. We had a natural study that occurred as part of one of our project sites. This was in Minnesota. We get a call from Dave Kleinhusen and says, hey, gentlemen, just to let you know, some of the trees toppled over a couple days after you installed the study. And Dave said, don't worry about it. I've got them re-straightened. But what Dave wanted to say was all my trees, the ones that I would not remove the package material, stayed upward. The ones that had some partial removal or full removal did topple over. So kind of a natural study. Next slide, please. And as Jake pointed out, you can delaminate disrupt root balls. And so those that had nothing removed, we did some observations. We did not have x-ray glasses like you get in the back of comic books, but we did have the field test where we found no disruption, but we did with the partial and the full removal. Now on a scale of 0 to 5, it was kind of a minor disruption. Next slide, please. And so visually, next slide, you can get a sense of intact where there's really no disruption versus full removal or partial. Yes, you get some minor potential disruption to the root ball system. And Andrew Koeser did his master's work finding that you can really abuse B&B trees and have very minimal effect on long-term survival. Next slide. And so if you are staking, I hope you do the upper slide. And it's not like I was trained when I was youngster, use the old garden hose with some wire because certainly you can cause girdling. So staking is needed for short doses though, about a year perhaps. And this is one of these observational things where you're going to have to make a decision. If you do remove packaging materials, staking may be one of these things that you need to consider. So just add that as part of your specifications. Next slide. And there's always the concern of tree swaying. So will trees sway and get a natural taper? The staking that we're talking about is short term. It's not to recorrect a defect. If the tree is already floppy, such as a swamp white oak or a hackberry perhaps, the staking is not going to recorrect that. And by proper staking, you will let the trees do some swaying so they can get some taper. This is an extreme taper on a windy site, but certainly staking is a short-term deal and it's to stabilize the plant because a root ball may have been disrupted. Next slide. Now let's talk about mulching, small doses. Okay, 2 to 4 inches. Previous slide, please. We can just start here. Yeah, so 2 to 4 inches, small doses, keep it away from the trunk. Next slide. I don't think I have to educate any of you on don't volcano mulch or don't flat top it. And don't mulch dead trees, that's just plain dumb. But why do we mulch? Next slide. The reason being is it could add perhaps some moisture content. And so this is some work that Jeff Isles did. And what Jeff found was that if you don't mulch, you may have warmer soils, which may be beneficial, but you may also have drier soils, which may be beneficial. But many times it's not. By adding or retaining soil moisture, mulch can be important. And in Jeff's work, it really didn't matter if it's inorganic mulch or organic mulch. I love organic mulch because it decomposes. The thing I don't like about inorganic mulch is I've had to remove enough inorganic mulch in my life as a practitioner, so I'd rather have it rot away. But regardless, that can add some ability for the plant to be for survival. Next slide. Now let's talk about watering, a very, very important thing. I'll just quickly go through this. Next slide. The important thing about watering is trees are not like chicken rotisseries. You do not set it and forget it. Perhaps you know the tagline from Ron Popeil. Next slide. And if we think about after planting, I can tell you this, if you don't water, trees will not grow as well if you water them. And maybe you remember from years ago, they used to recommend removing maybe a third of the above ground because you're compensating for root loss. And what was discovered by several studies, this is just one from England, from Walmsley. What they found was if you do water, you get greater growth, in this case, root length, elongation. But what they found was unpruned trees grew better. Why? Because unpruned trees have more buds producing auxin that are a growth regulator for stimulating root growth. So bottom line, water. And if you do water and you water correctly, pruning is not necessary. And now actually can be detrimental. Next slide. And so sun scald is one of these things that you perhaps hear about. Sun scald is a triggering event. Sun will desiccate tissue. It happens on the south side of trees. And it happens, as Don Rapola found out, when trees get desiccated from not watering. Next slide. And look at this elongation of this tree here. If you don't water trees, they're like forest trees. They'll start getting a very decurrent, deliquescent form to it. And this is because of moisture stress and auxin not being developed to a high enough level from photosynthetates. And so what will happen is lateral buds are not being kept in check and they'll compete for the terminal bud. So this can happen from a lack of watering at planting time. And this was proven actually from Ohio State University. They had a paper on this. Next slide. And so Ed Gilman found if you don't water trees, they don't grow as well. Surprise, surprise. Sometimes you do base research to actually find out the effects of, in this case, irrigation versus no irrigation. Next slide. What was really cool, what Ed discovered, was if you water plants, you save money. Because I don't know about you, but I get paid for success and dead trees are not successful. And so replanting dead trees following a lack of watering, Ed discovered in most all cases, it's beneficial. You save money by doing some preventive work so you're not causing mortality. Next slide, please. And then what University of Minnesota found, it's actually very inexpensive. It's only a few dollars for the summer for supplemental watering if you entice a homeowner to water a tree. Next slide. And whether you have a homeowner do it or you have a contractor or whomever you have involved with watering, it's all about you can water for no watering and take the roll of the dice, and maybe you get survival, maybe not, or you can maintain for survivability. So you water less frequently. In this case, maybe a small 2-inch caliper tree, you do it twice a week for a few months. And as trees get bigger, it's more, the watering prescription is longer. Or if you're managing for the best vitality, vigor, it could be daily watering. Next slide. And if you don't have the resources to water, plant smaller trees. Simple as this. This is one of my neighbor's trees I planted for them. Small seedling. We're treating it like a nursery tree. I gave them kind of the prescription on what to do. And I do their tree work. They do my snow removal. Life is good sometimes. Next slide. And pruning trees. On the home stretch here, is it really needed? Next slide. Is a formative pruning? It can be. Now, this is controversial. I just said don't prune at planting. Now, it may be the choice of snipping one branch or not at planting, or maybe within the first couple of years to make that decision to foster a permanent leader. Some central structure. Next slide. Because if you don't, this will happen. Next slide. And trees fail 40 years down the road, maybe 30, maybe 20 because of an ice storm. Next slide. But what was really interesting was Dr. Moore and his student Ryder, they discovered that formative pruning is inexpensive relative to structural pruning. And it was about 15 times less costly. So yes, does formative pruning cost money? Yes, but in the end of the game, it's much less costly. It's a good return on investment. Next slide. And then just on the home stretch here, as we talked today, we talked about Andrew's trees based on kind of site selection, thinking about planting area, soil volumes, etc. Roots at the surface, as Jake said. I'm summarizing, watering is probably more important in planting depth rather than the argument of wire basket removal or not. We would say it's your decision. Full disclosure, I remove the wire basket. I remove everything, okay? But I have folks that don't, and I support them too. A removed plastic container, yes, that's a non-negotiable thing. And I can tell you a little personal anecdote. I had a brother who said, hey, my tree's not doing well. I stopped over and I said, you didn't remove the plastic container. He said, well, I removed the bottom. And so no, that obviously was an issue. So other factors that could be needed. All right, next slide. There's a lot of good information, the ANSI A300 Part 6. It's coming out, the most recent version, so look for that. Next slide. And a lot of excellent publications out for Dr. Watson and his mentor, Gene Heimlich, along with the Z60.1 nursery standards. So next slide. We thank you for your time here today. There is a bonus BOGO here. You get CEUs for watching today, but if you also take this quiz in the current issue of Arborist News on this topical area, you're a winner. You're a winner nonetheless for just participating here today. And hopefully we have some time for questions here, Bo. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rich, Andrew, and Jake. A fantastic presentation. We are running low on time, and we have a lot of questions. So real quick, a housekeeping item before we dive into the questions. I know some of you may need to jump off this call. Just a reminder, the ISA CEUs, we will be sending those in on your behalf. So just make sure you are on for the entirety of today's webinar. So thanks, y'all. We'll go through a few questions. We're not going to get to them all. There's 38 as I count them now. But Andrew, jumping up at the top of the list, back to something you said, there was 2 questions here. They're very closely related, asking about, can soil depth make up for less area, or is area length and width more important for tree stability as it grows taller, wider, and heavier?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want to go wider if possible. I mean, and soil depth is important. I mean, if you have a shallow soil, you can have poorly rooted trees, but there's a limit to how deep roots can go without aeration, or if there's water logging lower down in the water. So, yeah, deep's important, but not as important as wide. So.
Yeah, and the other question was somebody was looking at kind of engineering, I think, their way with drainage and gravel, trying to find a way to make using augers and getting those roots to grow down. But is oxygen going to become a limiting factor there?
Yeah,
at
I
some
mean,
point?
they find like mesquite roots, like, hundreds of feet down in copper mines and stuff, but they're following a crack the whole way down. So if you don't have some sort of aeration, there's going to be a limit to how the roots can, respire and live and do what they need to do.
Thank you. And y'all, if you open up that Q&A and you want to help look at some of these questions here that jump out at y'all, please feel free to jump in on some of them as well. I'm scrolling through them here, looking for another good candidate.
I think a question on, would you advocate for leaving baskets on? I think it's one of these things, specify in a contract that if you want to leave it on, specify that it is on there, have full disclosure. Again, I do believe removing it, it's not harmful, but leaving it on, I think there's other things more important, like the watering and planting depth. So that's my battle on the deal. What do you think, Andrew or Jake?
Yeah, I mean, if it's something you want, I think you're, for whatever reason, just specify it, and whoever is bidding on it will just have to adhere to that. Either way, I think, like you said, it's the everybody wins study.
Yeah, I can tell you this from my giving this presentation enough times. My arborist friends, it's almost unanimous, remove it. My nursery friends, it's almost unanimous. Maybe not remove it because of disruption of the root ball. And I love a longer term study. So one of you on the call here today, take it on, do the next 25-year study, the retirement study.
Or if you had like a city where you were planting,
Yep.
and like you switched your practices, if you had the records, we could go and look at like a 5-year window before and after that change, if you knew what it was, and see if we see anything, so.
Here's one about commenting on alternatives to concrete sidewalks, like soil cells or structural soils. You have
Boy,
any comment?
I think the next presentation in November by Alessio, participate.
I'll second that, just in the fact that Alessio gives incredible talks. He's a brilliant and insightful guy, and I love hearing his presentations. I'm really looking forward to his talk next month. I encourage everyone to tune in.
Yep.
He's great.
And I should mention that Alessio's webinar next year presentation is a 10-year study, so it'll be a good one.
Fantastic.
We didn't really answer the question, but yeah, there are some cool alternatives out there for dealing with this.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, if you can find it, Larry Costello made a really nice book
Yep.
on alternative construction practices. I'm not sure if it's still in print. So quickly get on eBay before everyone else in this call and get whatever copies they are before they're, snatched up and then sell them again.
I think there's PDFs of it online with the U.S. Forest Service, Greg McPherson's old shop, but also City of Eugene has some great publications on this topical area, along with City of Seattle.
And I'll ask one more question with just a couple of minutes, maybe. What about root barriers with some of these? What are y'all experiencing, with some of these tighter areas to avoid some of that sidewalk buckling?
We actually use them quite a bit in my work, because my boss is really not into even cosmetic flaws with like the hardscaping. So the root barriers, you have a couple variants. You have some that are more fabric, that have growth hormones in them that will actually prevent roots from growing through them. And then you have physical barriers, like deep root. I think you can see them on all the different sites. And when you have the physical barrier, you're essentially forcing the roots down, and by the time they grow back up to the surface, they've hopefully cleared your sidewalk. So they have been pretty effective. Gilman also found that just putting a thick layer of gravel underneath the sidewalk will prevent the roots from growing. And I think I've seen Tom Smiley did a similar trial up at Bartlett. So that's very effective, is having a nice base layer of gravel that just doesn't have that moisture that roots really love under the sidewalk. Because oftentimes you have like moisture buildup right underneath the sidewalk, and the roots just thrive there at that barrier, and then that's when they expand and lift. you know.
Using a vertical barrier with gravel under the sidewalk appeared to alleviate a lot of that lifting in Gilman's study, at least. I think Smiley found similar.
Mhm.
Well, I think with y'all providing some of the economic incentives of what it costs to replace some of these, trying to get cities to adopt some of these techniques is going to be interesting. And Andrew, I really liked y'all's formula that y'all worked on, trying to understand, how much space and getting communities to think about that. So.
There's perhaps got time. One question. There was one about the soil types of our nurseries. One was a clay soil that was Manitowoc. Actually had no blow over there. It just was a fluke thing. There's no winds. The site, it was a sandy loamy soil in the Minnesota location. And yeah, that was a site that blew down. It also coincided with a straight line wind event. So we had about 40-mile-an-hour winds that happened, just hit the nursery after we put them in. And so I think that was the biggest factor. If we could predict wind and staking, that'd be fantastic. But in the Midwest, I can tell you wind's going to happen. So staking may be important. But again, getting back to the soil, it was a sandy loam soil in the Hardwood Creek nursery.
I'm a big fan of staking, honestly. I know people are worried about the taper, but we did a study on FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation sites. And when we did a nice little regression model, my student Seth put it all together. I was really impressed with what he did. And, if you have stakes in place they do it for 2 years at FDOT, and they check it, every year to make sure it's not girdling. You were 4 times less likely to have lawnmower damage, right? And then if you had mulch, you were 3 times less likely to have damage. So the combined effect of mulching, there we go. Rich is adding for us 7 times less likely to have damage if you put staking in place and mulch. So, I mean, I've weed whacked enough Arbor Day Foundation trees to know you can get a little careless, and then another thing he found out is there's like a hangover factor. So if someone's having a bad Monday, they tend to hit all the trees in a row. So you got to be careful for that,
Sounds like a human dimension study there.
Yeah.
Hey, there was a question from Minnesota with Julie at the US or Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. She had a question about the burlap breaking down. Yeah, that could add some carbon to the soil. I think what's more important we didn't mention was the burlap we used was decomposable. It was not copper treated to the level of being stable for many, many years. It had a small dose of copper just to prevent it from degrading in a short time period, like months. And so if it is a synthetic burlap, I don't think anybody advocates to leave that on. So that's an important context. I think maybe one to end with today here, because we're 7 after the hour.
So yeah, thanks, Rich, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Jake, for a fantastic presentation today. I wish we could go on I know you guys got a little rushed. That's fantastic information. We got a little quick there at the end. Please be aware this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on treefund.org. Go to the webinar tab, recordings, watch it, share it. It's a great resource. You guys cover just a broad spectrum of very applied science, new emerging science, which is what we're about on this webinar series. And so thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Rachel, for giving us the Tree Fund update of what's going on. Don't forget to support Tree Fund. You guys like this type of emerging research. It comes from donations from people like you and I out there. So,
And that's how we can do the longer studies also, is with donations. So
absolutely. So with that, thank you, Monica. If y'all have any questions, please email Monica about anything related to CEUs. And Monica will throw that real quick into the chat box so y'all can click on it. And with that, have a good rest of your Tuesday, a good rest of your week. And we will see y'all back on, what's the date for Alyssio's?
November 16th.
November 16th. And so kind of a continuation. So looking at, trees growing in those dense urban environments. And so go to treefund.org and you can find that listing to register. Actually, I got to create it, so give me a day or so. So with that, thank you all very much and have a good rest of your week.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, nice, thanks.
Bye.